Do you ever walk into a room and forget why you're there? Stare at a sentence you just read and it's gone. Feel more wired, more foggy, more forgetful than ever? You're not imagining it. You're not losing it. Your brain is going through the menopause transition. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Lila Landowski, a neuroscientist, award winning science communicator, and a powerful voice in women's brain health. Together, we unpack what really is happening in your brain during this hormonal transition. Whether you're feeling flat, forgetful, sleep deprived, or just want to future proof your brain, this one's a must listen. Let's get into it. Lila, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. I know we have been dying to have more of a conversation since I met you last year in Tasmania, so welcome.
Great to be here.
I'm going to just jump right in. What I was thinking about in the last couple of days is that we talk and think a lot about things like heart health, gut health, skin health. People do liver detoxes and all sorts of things. And we even talk a lot about mental health, but we don't really talk a lot about brain health. And I would love to know, what is brain health and what can we do to be supporting or future-proofing our brains as sort of women in midlife?
When we think about brain health, it's sort of anything that improves the quality of and the maintenance of your brain function. And when we talk about things that protect our heart, a lot of the things that protect our heart and cardiovascular health, it's going to help our brain health as well. Because at the end of the day, our brain is using about 20% of our blood supply and the energy and the nutrients delivered from our blood at any point in time. So it's extremely hungry. It is extremely metabolically active. So there are lots of different things that we can do to, I guess, take care of our brain health. And some of the big things really are the things that are good for our heart: exercise, diet, keeping our cholesterol levels down. All of those things come together and make sure that our blood vessels in the brain are, that they're strong and healthy, and also making sure that the neurons in our brain and the other cells that are in our brain are also functioning well.
What is the thing that you think that people don't know about their brains? Like one thing that if they could only change that would make quite a big difference in their brain health?
I would say the importance of exercise. Because when we think of exercise, we think of it as maybe making our bodies look nice or being fit or whatever it might be. But for the longest time, we thought we had a set number of brain cells, and that as we got older, we lost some of them. If we hit our head, we lost some of them, and that was the end of it. But the reality is, our brain has the ability to make new brain cells. We have stem cells in the brain, and they are making these brand new brain cells. So we have the potential to replenish the number of neurons in certain parts of the brain, particularly the parts of the brain that are involved in learning and memory. So exercise, when you're exercising, you're increasing blood flow to the brain. So that's great. You're also increasing the formation of things like brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a brain fertilizer. It helps brain cells connect and survive and just exist. It's also, when you're exercising, you're also releasing things like osteocalcin from your bones, which also helps your brain health. It's also helping your brain remove waste. Now, most of the waste in your brain builds up throughout the course of the day, and most of it gets removed at nighttime when you sleep. But exercise also helps to get rid of it as well. So all of these things come together in this beautiful way to help your brain ultimately be healthier. So I think the number one thing that you can do for brain health is exercising. It's making new brain cells.
Oh, I love that. We're always, as you say, thinking about our muscles or our heart health or maybe focusing on our weight and thinking that's the reason to exercise. But that is so interesting. And just to take it a step further, obviously, you and I are both really interested in peri and menopausal women, and a lot of them are struggling with their brain function. And I want to talk about that in lots of depth with you today. But just as a by the by, is one of the reasons why they've got kind of brain fog symptoms is because their brain's not being cleaned at night with a really good night's sleep?
If you have not slept well, then that will definitely cause brain fog. But when we're talking about the brain fog that happens during perimenopause and through postmenopause times, that's a very distinct process. That's separate to, I guess, the lack of sleep or the disruption of sleep.
So let's dive in and let's talk about what is actually happening to our brains during the perimenopause and menopause, because the reality is it is mostly brain symptoms, I have to say, that my patients complain of.
Yeah, look, I mean, we think of the brain as kind of being a static structure that it doesn't really change, but it does. Every part of our body is changing. Our skin is replenishing itself every 28 days. Our bones are over the course of a year by about 10%, but our brain is also changing subtly, not just through the menstrual cycle, but especially through perimenopause and postmenopause. So we can think of that as really being a time of transformation in our brains. So when we think about the hormones that are involved in this process, estrogen, it's a human hormone. We need to stop thinking about it as a women's hormone. I know you talk about this all the time, but it's really important in terms of how it affects the brain and how our brain functions, especially as it relates to things like stress and memory as well. So ultimately, the brain and the ovaries are communicating by sharing these hormones. So estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and they're ultimately influencing how the brain functions. So when we think of estrogen, it's an anti-inflammatory. It helps protect the brain. It also helps increase the amount of blood that goes to the brain. It helps the brain be more neuroplastic. So what I mean by that is it helps the brain be more adaptable. It's more able to change and help us to learn. It makes our brain cells much better at using energy as well. And the more energy that your brain has, the better your brain can function, right? So ultimately, it leads to our brain having more of these neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, glutamate, oxytocin, right? And all of these neurotransmitters and neuromodulators are really important for changing how our brain functions. It's really important for learning and memory and mood and how motivated we are. And it helps us connect to the people around us. So all of these things come together in terms of when estrogen drops, all these things are going to be influenced as well.
So many women come in and say things like they feel disconnected. They sometimes are with their families or their partners or their children who they've previously been very engaged with, and they feel separate to them, and they feel like sometimes like they're nearly watching their life unfold around them, but they don't feel engaged. So is that an estrogen response or lack of estrogen response?
Look, it's probably a little bit of uh, estrogen and it's probably a little bit of progesterone as well. So progesterone is also really important here, and it helps make our brain a lot more sensitive to this neurotransmitter called GABA. So GABA is basically what we call an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and it's really important in helping us regulate our mood. It helps us feel calm. It helps us be more resilient to stress. It's really important for sleep. And, for anyone who's still having a period, it's lowest around when your period starts. So that's why you're likely to feel more emotional, because you have less of that GABA able to act in your brain. So it's essentially acting as a bit of an anti-anxiety kind of function in the brain. And a lot of anti-anxiety drugs that we take affect this neurotransmitter as well. So I think a lot of these things are kind of interacting together to make us lose that resilience to stress and lose that ability to calm ourselves naturally in various situations. Ultimately, it does make sense that we feel less connected to others around us during that time. And it's affecting things like oxytocin, the hormone that's involved in this feeling of connection with one another. So it's all coming together to affect how we feel in those situations.
I know it's very complicated and there are so many things interplaying between each other, and we don't know it all. But, just for anyone listening, common things that people tell me are they feel anxious, like they have never felt anxiety like this before, or they feel overwhelmed with situations. They feel like they used to be able to multitask and juggle all the balls, and suddenly they feel like not only can they not juggle all the balls anymore, but they kind of just don't want to. Like they're just done. They're so over the whole scenario of feeling responsible for everyone. And it is so interesting to understand how hormones are really at play here. I mean, of course, it can be life circumstances as well. Women kind of got to the point where they've kind of had enough, but it is interesting to see how much hormone disruption can be impacting mood and ability to sort of get through the day.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we think of estrogen as something that helps our brain make um, more of these hormones involved in motivation, like dopamine, if you've got slightly less dopamine, then yes, you will feel less motivated. If it's making your brain less able to use energy, then yes, of course you're going to feel less able to think clearly or do things in the way that you used to. Of course, it's going to make it a lot harder for you to find the words as you're talking. Of course, it's going to make you feel less happy. If it's leading to reductions in neurotransmitters and neuromodulators like serotonin, which is really important for mood, then losing that or having slight decreases in that level will make you feel, it'll impact your mood. It'll make you feel more likely to feel depressed.
Yeah, absolutely. And then what about, Leila, whenever you have women who are having symptoms that look like ADHD or sort of neurodiversity being unmasked? I know there seems to be a little bit of a debate here that perimenopause and that changes in hormones are unmasking an underlying issue that was already there but was probably, not diagnosed because the person was a female. And then there's another group of people who think, no, it's not. It's just that people aren't coping and they're feeling more chaotic. Where do you feel about that situation? Because lots of women are currently being diagnosed with ADHD in midlife.
Yeah, that's a great one. It really does unmask those um, conditions like ADHD. And I think when we think about ADHD, so, ADHD is associated with having slightly less of these neurotransmitters and neuromodulators like dopamine and noradrenaline in different pathways in the brain. And we also know that loss of estrogen means you also have less of those things. So let's say you've got ADHD and you've found ways to, cope with it. You've developed strategies to allow you to deal with life as a person with ADHD. When your hormones drop even further, when serotonin and dopamine drops even further, then it just becomes a lot harder to use those strategies that you might have been able to use effectively. So that's why we really see things like ADHD and autism becoming unmasked during that period of time. We have this huge blossoming of diagnoses during that period.
It is absolutely that people have just developed such a long list of coping strategies. They've battled through, they've kind of hidden it and been able to manage it by, bringing lots of strategies to life. And then whenever all these hormones begin to either fluctuate or disappear, the wheels just come off that sort of strategy list and things just start to fall apart a little bit.
Yeah, that's right. And I think especially if you combine it with, say, someone with a higher IQ on average, then maybe you're more likely to have some of these coping mechanisms and finding ways to navigate the world around you. So I think that's why we're especially seeing a high level of a late diagnosis of ADHD in high performing women through perimenopause.
So when I was at medical school, which was a very long time ago now, I think I started medical school in 1994, so that was a long time ago. I don't remember them talking at all about estrogen, progesterone, or testosterone having any involvement in brain activity whatsoever. So is all this kind of new?
Yeah, it really is. I mean, we first learnt about what we called our sex hormones in, I guess, in the early 1900s, but it wasn't really until the last, 50 years or so that we started to realize, okay, they're actually human hormones. They're affecting women's brains and men's brains. They are affecting things like learning and memory. And I guess it's only really, since the late 1990s that we've really shown that these hormones have a really potent effect on our brain, and it's not just about reproduction.
Leila, whenever we're thinking about women who maybe have premenstrual dysphoric disorder, some used to be called PMS, and where they maybe feel very depressed or very tearful or extremely angry. Some women are even suicidal at before their periods. What's going on there, and how can we explain that? Because presumably that's a hormonal issue.
For those of us who have periods, that hormones like progesterone are lowest around when your period starts. And that's when we also tend to feel the most emotional, right? And that's because we've got this interaction with progesterone and this inhibitory neurotransmitter called GABA. So, GABA is really important in allowing us to self-regulate. It helps us to feel calm. It helps us to feel more resilient. It helps us to, I guess, really regulate our mood and rein in emotions that we normally would be able to rein in. So if you're losing the ability to control those emotions in the way that you normally would, it's completely normal. It's because we've lost that extra layer of regulation in our brain. So we've got this thing called executive function in our brain, and it's really important for allowing us to, I guess, rein in and know what's socially appropriate in different situations. So if you were to look at me and say, "Oh, Lila, that jacket looks terrible on you," you'd think it in your mind, but you wouldn't say it out loud. And that's our executive control basically coming into play. And, you're using your knowledge to know that that's not maybe not appropriate thing to say. But when we have decreases in progesterone, especially, it's making it a lot harder for us to, tap into those systems and help us regulate how we speak and how we think, and ultimately how we interact in those situations and how we feel.
And lots of women in the perimenopause will describe feeling a rage, an increase of irritability, inability to tolerate people. So, the classic husband chewing too loudly or, getting extraordinarily angry at someone for snoring or whatever it happens to be. How can we explain that?
So this is still tied into this, this ability to regulate our moods and our emotions, but it's also really tied into stress. So we become a lot less resilient to stress through perimenopause and beyond. And ultimately, there's a few things at play. Life is complicated. Life is full of stresses. Life is full of things that we can't control. We're trying to juggle a lot of things. We're getting stuck in traffic. We're worried about paying the bills and getting the groceries and getting kids to school. All of those things are, these are fundamentally stresses to the brain. And the more stressed we are, then the more that has the ability to impact our brain. So we have this system called our sympathetic nervous system, our flight or fright system. So we have this thing called our sympathetic nervous system, which we call our fight or flight system. So I'll just call it our fight or flight system from now on. So our fight or flight system is allowing us to deal with these stresses as they arise. And every time we experience something in our life, that system becomes activated and it helps mobilize our energy stores and help us deal with that situation. It helps us get through whatever it is. But if we're constantly having that stress system activated and we're constantly having our fight or flight system activated, then ultimately it does take a toll on the body. Over time, let's say you've been chronically stressed and you can't switch that stress response off for weeks, months, years, our brain changes. So our brain changes in a number of really important ways. And one of the key ways that it changes is also to do with our ability to regulate our mood. So one of the parts of the brain that we often see affected in chronic stress is the amygdala, which is the emotion part of the brain. And it doesn't just change, it actually becomes slightly bigger. And the bigger your amygdala is, then the more aggressive you are. Doesn't matter what species you are, animal, human, rat, the bigger your amygdala, the more emotional you will be. And we also have this disconnect with that prefrontal cortex, the decision-making part of the brain. So not only are you potentially more aggressive, you're also less able to regulate that mood. You're less able to rein in your perspectives. And you're also less able to see other people's perspective as well. You become really introspective. So you're thinking about what's happening to yourself. You're thinking about what's happening in your internal world. And you're not thinking about how other people's lives are leading to them behaving in a certain way. So you become more selfish. And it's not your fault. It's literally just your brain trying to cope with that chronic stress. Okay, so if we know that those changes are happening to people in the setting of chronic stress, if you then add the extra layer of the loss of estrogen and this loss of progesterone and this dysregulation and your lack of ability or loss of ability to use those systems as well, it just makes it a lot more difficult. So it's not that we are more emotional. It's not that we are bad people, or it's not that we are more aggressive. It's just our brain's way of trying to cope with that situation. So we need to have empathy for ourselves and for others during that time.
Yeah, very difficult. I had a patient yesterday and she had worked for the same company for 24 years and she'd never had any kind of issue, nothing but sort of glowing reviews every year. And then in the last year and a half, she sort of had two sort of major complaints from colleagues about, her aggressive tone in emails and things. And it's just she's very upset and she actually did have, really quite in good insight. She said, "Look, I know that I'm really angry and I'm have a lot less toleration and I've reread some of the emails and they were a bit they were a bit rough." So it's just there's definitely real life examples every day.
That's one of the things I kind of have liked about AI tools in that you can now write those emails and use it to kind of filter out and say, help me make the tone of this email a little bit more warm, and help use those tools to actually, deal with those situations and help, check yourself when you're talking to others.
Yeah, good old AI. Leila, for anyone who's listening who hasn't experienced brain fog, lots of women certainly describe it. What are they trying to articulate? Because it's definitely one of those ones that it's very hard to explain.
It's more than just a fuzzy feeling. You can't find your words. Your memory is just, you can't access your thoughts. You have difficulties with attention. You can't concentrate. You have trouble with language. I think the most common one is being unable to find words and having a mental blank. And about 62% of women with perimenopause and beyond will have brain fog. So it's a really, really common symptom. But I mean, here's the thing, when you're looking at brains of women before and after menopause, the ones before menopause, you have a lot more blood flow to the brain and your neurons are burning energy really effectively. So that way that, there's more energy available to use in all the processes involved in thinking and learning and doing those things, right? After perimenopause and after menopause, there's a 30% drop in our brain's ability to use glucose, our brain's energy, right? So if they're not burning energy as efficiently, of course you're going to be fatigued. Of course you're going to have brain fog. And of course you're going to have a harder time thinking. And I think this really validates what we've been saying for years, is that yes, there's something going on in our brains to make us feel this fatigue and make us feel foggy in the brain. And if like communication is your superpower, many women rely on it for work, and that's a really jarring experience. So you've got to really be kind to yourself. We see like, 1 in 5 women will quit their jobs through that time because it is such a tricky thing.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of women will describe, particularly not being able to find nouns, so they can't remember the name for things. And particularly if you're someone who, as you say, has had communication as a superpower and they've been someone who's led meetings and always been a great presenter at work, and suddenly you kind of lose that skill. It's absolutely wreaks havoc with people's confidence and they begin to doubt themselves. And certainly as a doctor for years, I have seen so many women present thinking they've either got dementia or a brain tumor. Because sometimes for some women, the symptoms are really quite extreme, and they can feel that their abilities are really beginning to undermine their career.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important to say that, yes, studies say that there's on average a 30% drop in how well our brain uses energy after menopause, but it varies. And some people will have a much more pronounced effect, and some people won't, right? So it is a bit of a spectrum. And I think that's a really important thing to point out.
So we know that women are disproportionately affected by Alzheimer's disease, and it's certainly something that strikes a lot of fear into women. I think, well, it strikes fear into both sexes, but I think, perhaps women are often the carers for elderly parents, and they're often very frightened at the thought of developing Alzheimer's. As you've just described, we are seeing this reduction in blood flow and ability for the brain in a postmenopausal woman to metabolize glucose, etc., and use it for brain purposes. Is that the connection? Is that what's going on? Why are we outnumbering men so many to one in the dementia wards and in the nursing homes?
Yeah, I think it's that combined with disruption of sleep. So sleep is really important for clearing that waste that builds up in the brain. So we have this system called the glymphatic system, which is basically our brain's waste removal process, and that is most active at night. So if you're not getting that clearance of waste throughout like a full night's sleep, then proteins and toxins that are associated with Alzheimer's disease actually will build up in the brain. So the more sleep disruption you have, then the more risk of dementia you'll ultimately have as a result of that. So when we combine that as well with, the drop in estrogen, and, estrogen is a really protective thing for the brain. Yeah, we consider it to be neuroprotective, then those two things probably are coming together.
Ladies, are you feeling flat, foggy, or like you've lost touch with who you used to be? Well, it's time to rediscover you. After 25 plus years as a doctor working with women as a GP, an aesthetic doctor, and in women's health, I've created the 16-week Rediscover You program to help you reclaim your energy, confidence, and vitality. This guided, evidence-based journey is specifically designed to support you through the perimenopause and menopause. Together, we'll reset your hormones, boost your energy levels, create sustainable weight management, and restore the clarity and glow you deserve. We'll take a deep dive into what's really happening inside your body, from hormonal shifts and skin changes to disrupted sleep patterns and mood swings. You'll get the tools and understanding to navigate the powerful transition with confidence, clarity, and care, because you deserve to feel like you again. Our waitlist is now open. Click the link in the show notes to save your place. Lila, I know I'm probably putting you a little bit on the spot here, but there's definitely lots of sort of quite famous neuroscientists at the minute who've been getting a lot of publicity for their research into dementia and connections with the menopause. Can you tell us a little bit about where those studies are going, or what the latest information seems to be? And, does it look like HRT is going to be something that is protective of the brain? Like, do we know that? Or is that still very much something that sort of the jury is out on in terms of firm evidence?
So menopause does change your brain as much as it changes your ovaries, right? And all of these things are going to be linked to your risk of things like dementia. And the most common form of dementia, of course, is Alzheimer's disease. So lots of the research about menopause and dementia is really about menopause and Alzheimer's disease. So when we look at that, a lot of big studies have shown that people who do take this hormone replacement therapy have less risk of Alzheimer's disease, up to 50% less Alzheimer's disease. But that's not really looking at cause and effect. It's more of an association. So we do know that brain shrinkage that we see that happens through menopause, part of it is related to reduced brain function. But I think the really exciting news is that hormone replacement therapy can prevent it if you take those hormones within about 5 years of menopause. So if you take hormone replacement therapy, you have better retention of brain structure, brain metabolism, your verbal memory is more likely to be preserved, all those sorts of things. And perhaps maybe even most interesting is that the people who are most at risk of Alzheimer's, so people with a particular gene called ApoE, those women are actually more likely to see an effect of hormone replacement therapy. So I think it's a really positive outcome and very encouraging for us.
Are there any other things that we can be doing to prevent ourselves from developing dementias?
Lots of different things. So there's actually a really cool study published in Lancet in 2024, and they've been doing this study for a long time. They keep updating it with new and new evidence, and they've since shown that about 45% of dementia can be prevented, which I think is a really huge and potentially exciting statistic. That we actually have the ability to change our risk of getting dementia. So there are 14 different risk factors that we can actually, consider and try and reduce in our lives that will ultimately reduce our risk of dementia. So, the number one risk for any kind of neurodegenerative disease is our age, and we can't change that. So let's talk about the things that we can change. One of them is actually smoking. So it makes your blood vessels fragile. It makes your blood much more sticky and more likely to form a clot, and therefore can lead to strokes, which would affect your risk of dementia. Having things like high blood pressure, that also impacts us as well, because it makes your blood vessels in your brain much more fragile and much more likely to burst, causing a hemorrhage. So that's also, a risk factor for dementia as well. Depression. So there's a link between depression and dementia. It's a bit of a grey area, because we also see that in people who have dementia, depression sort of precedes it as well. So it's a bit hard to know whether the two things, whether one is causing the other or whether they're just linked. We know that having a head injury, like traumatic brain injury, is very much linked to your risk of having dementia. Having a high BMI is linked to diabetes and high blood pressure. It also puts your body in a much more inflammatory state. And the more inflammation you have, the higher risk you have of lots of different brain diseases like multiple sclerosis, even things like depression and brain fog. Diabetes. Okay, so diabetes or high blood glucose for long periods of time, it leads to the formation of these things called advanced glycation end products. So bear with me for a second here. It's the same kind of reaction that makes seared meat go brown. Okay, so imagine what it's doing to the cells in your body, especially the cells that hang around the longest, which are your neurons, right? So when high blood glucose reacts with proteins in our neurons, right, those neurons don't work as efficiently. So they're much less efficient at doing their job. And even though our skin cells turn over every 28 days, it's not so bad, but you have those neurons for the entirety of your life. Yes, you're making new ones, but the ones that you have, you keep. And so that damage is going to hang around in your brain forever. So high blood glucose is also going to stop your brain from making new brain cells as well. It has all these different effects that sort of come together and affect how our brain functions. Things like alcohol. So, that's fundamentally alcohol is a neurotoxin, and no amount of alcohol has actually been shown to be good anymore. So we used to think that one glass was okay. Now, even just one glass leads to the brain shrinking slightly. Another thing that we can do is being socially connected. Social isolation and loneliness is, leads to about a 30% increased risk of dying. It's huge, right? And that's because, you know, socializing with people you like, especially if you engage with in physical contact, if you hug them, it has to be consensual, of course, but, it's releasing this beautiful cocktail of neurotransmitters like oxytocin and endorphins. And that has an array of effects, which include reducing the levels of our stress hormone cortisol. Okay. So, social connectedness is one of the easiest and best things that we can try and do. And it's one of the best predictors of happiness and our health in late life as well. So the longest running study in the world, which is the Harvard study of adult development, it's been going for over 80 years. One of the most startling lessons from that study is that one of the best predictors of a person's overall health, more than their genetics, more than their IQ, more than their social class, more than their income, more than any of that, is actually their connectedness and the relationships that they have in middle age. So having, good connections in middle age is a really good predictor of not only dementia risk, but also your happiness. So I think that's really important. Things like exposure to air pollution, even how much education we have. And that's a tricky one because we do see that people who have a lower education are more at risk of dementia. But if that might sound a bit, confronting to some people to hear, but the reason why that association probably exists is because on average, people with a lower level of education tend to have more repetitive jobs and less, and people with a higher education tend to have more mentally stimulating jobs. So that can also, buffer your risk of dementia as well. And even quite surprisingly, having hearing loss and vision loss really increases a person's risk of dementias as well. And that's probably because it makes it harder to socialize. So if you've got vision loss, get glasses. If you've got hearing loss, look at getting hearing aids. It really does make a huge influence on your risk of dementia.
Yeah, I was chatting with a couple of patients yesterday in my GP clinic, just reinforcing exactly that. I'd read a study that was really quite, it was quite encouraging for people to get hearing aids because that loss of hearing just does make people disengage from conversation. And really, the statistics were quite stark in comparison to people with better hearing versus worse hearing and ending up with a dementia diagnosis. Obviously, you've talked about a lot of risk factors there. So really, it does sound like kind of the brain needs novelty and a challenge, because that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? If you've got a boring, repetitive job, I don't know, the classical Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, his dad putting the lids on toothpaste. I think that's what his dad's job was. Um, Obviously, a really boring job is not going to stimulate you like someone who's got something very exciting to do. Why does the brain want novelty?
There's this concept called cognitive reserve. So the more rich and varied and exciting things that we do in our lives, the more, I guess, cognitive reserve we have. And the more of it we have, the more of it we can potentially lose before we start to see symptoms of dementia. And I guess really at the end of the day, our brains are wired for novelty. Like if things are interesting, then we're going to be drawn to that. We have these systems in our brain, our reward systems in our brain that pull us to, novel situations. We have these, chemicals that will be released like dopamine in order to drive us to do those things. And that's not a fluke. that is because anything that is new is potentially something that might be beneficial to you in your life.
Lots of women feel like they are multitaskers. Um, I always think that I'm a great multitasker, but again, I've read some evidence recently that would suggest that we're probably not as good at multitasking as we actually think. So, multitasking versus monotasking. What's the best one approach?
Monotasking. Our brain isn't designed to context switch. So, our working memory, which is our super short term memory, which is just holding the information that you're doing right now, that gets overloaded. And during perimenopause and beyond, our working memory doesn't work as well. So, multitasking, which is tricky enough for the brain at the best of times, becomes especially hard because we have to hold all that information in our mind at once. Now, we've got attentional systems in our brain that allow us to focus on things. And they also really struggle when we're multitasking. So, our brain basically has to figure out how to filter out irrelevant information, and it has to decide where it's going to put all of its energy. But that can also get really overwhelmed through perimenopause. So, if you think of it like this, so attention only lets so much information through. Okay. The point of attention is only to let as much information as you need to get the job done, to do whatever it is that you're focused on. So you're discarding all the information that's irrelevant. So, classic example, you're in the car, you're talking to someone on the phone while you're driving. You have to pay attention to everything around you. You have to listen to what they're saying. You have to listen to, you know, you have to look at the environment. You have to make sure that what the cars around you are doing, what the traffic lights are doing, and if you're paying too much attention to the words, then that part of the brain of the signal, that signal in the brain is becoming amplified. So you can actually hear what they're saying. But those networks then aren't available for the part of the brain that's focused on driving and visual things. So your attention to driving is going to go down. So you're going to miss things and you're more likely to have an accident. And, just because you're looking at the road doesn't mean that your driving isn't impaired. Okay. So the neurons that are involved in processing visual information aren't going to be as heavily utilized if you're thinking about what you're listening to and you're listening to the words. So, sensory overload is really this thing that happens when our senses are being overwhelmed and it's bringing in more information than we can actually process in any particular time. And our attention systems normally, allow us to focus on one thing and block out the rest of it. Now, when we become overwhelmed with sensory information or sensory overload, it basically triggers our stress systems, that fight or flight system. Um, Being in a big crowd is a classic example of that. So, you might see kids covering their eyes or their ears because they're becoming overwhelmed by all the sensory information to try and block it out, or they might throw a tantrum. That's because their stress systems are being activated. The kid's not naughty, it's just that sensory overwhelm is triggering that stress response. So ultimately, all of these things are coming together, and it's making it very hard to, do anything more than focus on one thing at a time. So we're designed to monotask, not multitask. And it becomes especially hard through perimenopause and beyond.
Yeah, I think we're probably all guilty of doing that car journey where even if we're chatting on a hands-free phone, which hopefully everyone is if they're doing it, you get to the end of the journey and you think, "Ooh, I can't really remember most of that journey home," which
How did I
is,
get there?
yeah,
Yeah.
how did I get
Or when
there?
you turn down the volume just so you can concentrate on the road.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I wanted to ask you, I know that you have a TEDx talk and you talked about some brain hacks that could be helpful. I wonder, would you share some of those with us today?
Yeah, sure. So the TED Talk was about the secret of learning faster and more effectively. And these are things that I think we intuitively know, but until you realize that there's neuroscience behind it, which is only which we're learning more and more over time, that it makes a lot of sense. So things to improve our learning ultimately are attention, alertness, sleep, repetition, taking breaks, and making mistakes. So in order to learn, you've got to pay attention to the thing that you're learning. It makes sense. And you've got to be alert. So you don't want to be tired or sleepy. Those things are fairly intuitive, right? And it's also why things like caffeine can be beneficial because it increases your alertness. And also, it's why exercise can be really useful as well because it increases your attention and your alertness. It's basically when you're exercising, it's increasing the level of these neurotransmitters that are important for your attention. So that's why it's a lot easier to pay attention if you've just done some exercise. So if you've got a really important meeting or something that you need to focus on, run up and down the stairs at work or do some star jumps or do whatever it is to get that blood pumping. And that's also going to help you focus on the task at hand. In terms of sleep, well, we need sleep for lots of different things. It resets our metabolism, it resets our emotional control, it resets our immune system. But most importantly for memory, it's when our short-term memories get turned into long-term memories. So when we're sleeping, that's when that process happens. During the course of the day, we have this thing called the hippocampus, which is basically our brain's diary. It's keeping track of what we're doing from minute to minute. And if I was to ask you what you were doing before, doing this podcast, you're using your hippocampus to recall that information. So it's keeping it in there for the short term. But when we sleep, that short-term information then gets moved off into long-term memory storage. So if you don't sleep, then that information just gets eroded. It literally gets removed. Okay. So you have to sleep if you want to have any chance of, consolidating the things that you've learned, whether it's information or, learning a sport or learning a technique or doing something new at work. That sleep is really critical for that. And I think probably my favorite one is the importance of making mistakes. So when we make a mistake, and we feel a bit anxious and feel a bit uncomfortable, that's because we are releasing these neuromodulators and neurotransmitters that help us pay attention. And if you think about it, it makes sense. You've made a mistake and your body has picked up that you've made a mistake and it wants you to do the thing better and it wants you to try again. Okay. So we've got this increase in focus and attention and agitation because the things are linked. And that helps us to then continue and do the task and pay attention so we don't get it wrong. So when we make a mistake and we feel a bit anxious and then we eventually do the thing right, whatever it is that we're trying to learn, we then also release neuromodulators like dopamine. And dopamine is really important, not just for making us feel good, but also it helps to solidify that memory and really consolidate that learning. So that's why it's really handy sometimes to turn your learning into a bit of a game. If you're trying to learn a topic, quiz yourself on the topic before you're ready. Just do the quizzes and test your knowledge. And when you get something wrong, you're going to feel a bit anxious naturally, but you're never going to forget that thing. If you can think about times in your life in the past where you made a mistake, you remember that mistake, right? And that's not a fluke. That is because our brain's chemical processes are there to help us retain that information. So making mistakes, don't frame it as, you're not doing well. Frame it as, great, this is my brain's way of priming me to learn more effectively. And then, of course, breaks. Breaks is a really important thing as well. So our learning, the things that we learn, they're actually pretty fragile. They don't, they're very fragile after we've just made these new connections in the brain. And if you try and do something that is going to take a lot of effort after you've just learnt something, there's actually a chance that you can actually essentially, remove those new connections, essentially wipe the brain clean from the things that you've just learnt. So it's really important to take a break after you've learnt something. In adults, we ideally at least an hour after learning something, you want to take that much of a break, which can be really difficult in the workplace setting. You've just learnt something or of a colleague and then you need to then do your work. I think my suggestion would be in that situation is if you have to work, do the tasks that don't require that you can do on autopilot, maybe answering emails or filling out a spreadsheet. Do those things that don't require a lot of focus after you've learnt something new. So all those things together can really be beneficial for increasing our ability to learn more effectively.
Amazing. We will have a link in our show notes that will take any listeners to have a listen to your TEDx talk. Um, I want to finish this section of the podcast just by trying to understand if someone is taking menopausal hormone therapy, how quickly would we be expecting to see a change in those brain symptoms? Like, how quickly do those hormones go in and fix things like, the hot flushes versus someone who's really got, severe anxiety and depression? Are we expecting different things from different symptoms?
Yes, look, I think a really useful rule of thumb is the longer that you've been experiencing these changes, the longer it's going to take for you to bounce back or, see a change in the positive direction. And that's because change in our brain takes time. And yes, even though you're taking these hormone replacement therapies, we do very quickly have changes in our circulating levels of hormones, but the change in the brain take time. So it could be weeks, it could even be months, but it will be a gradual progression. So you do have to be patient. And a lot of these changes associated with attention or verbal fluency or mood, they might take a little bit longer than, things like hot flushes, for example.
Yeah. Okay. That's so interesting. Leila, I want to talk to you a little bit now about the brain and sleep. So I would say in most patients, issues with sleep in the perimenopause and menopausal transition are at least in the top three symptoms. So, for some women, is not being able to get to sleep. For other women, it is falling asleep reasonably easily, but waking up at 2:06 every morning, wide awake, exhausted, but absolutely unable to get back to sleep. What on earth is behind those two sleep issues that seem to become really so debilitating and distressing to women?
There's a few things at play here. So, part of it is our stress hormones, and part of it is to do with melatonin. So, maybe if I just start with melatonin. So, melatonin is a hormone that our brain makes to help us fall asleep. So, as light goes down, then the levels of melatonin goes up in our brain, and that's a natural way of, I guess, triggering our circadian rhythm to help us to fall asleep. Now, the tricky thing through perimenopause and beyond is that you have slight decreases in the level of serotonin in the brain. Now, serotonin gets made into melatonin. So when you think of it in that way, it makes sense that as your serotonin dips down slightly, your melatonin production also dips down slowly. Melatonin is really important for helping you get to sleep. So that's why we see these links between difficulties getting to sleep and perimenopause. In terms of waking up, could be a few things. So, a hot flash will wake you up, absolutely. Particularly if you're in the lighter stages of sleep. We also know that your body wants to keep your blood glucose really stable, right, throughout the course of the day, and we have mechanisms in our body to make sure that that happens. And when there is enough blood glucose, we feel compelled to eat, or we have our body will break down those energy stores to make that energy supply consistent. Okay. Now, the way our body does that is by releasing things like cortisol. Now, the tricky thing is, cortisol is the number one signal that makes us wake up in the morning. So, when we wake, just before we wake up, there's this massive spike in cortisol and we wake up. Okay. So, having high levels of cortisol at bedtime will make it hard to go to sleep. Having high levels of cortisol at bedtime will also mean that you're more likely to wake up during the night. But also, if you have low blood glucose at nighttime, you're going to release cortisol, and you're probably going to release slightly more cortisol than someone who hasn't gone through perimenopause yet. So, if estrogen is helping your muscles and your liver respond to insulin, long story short is that post-menopause, you're more likely to have bigger spikes in cortisol to help your body regulate your blood glucose. And a bigger cortisol spike during the middle of the night is going to wake you up because it's going to lead, to that cortisol affecting your attentional systems and making you feel a lot more alert. So all of these things are kind of coming in together to affect our sleep.
I want to step back a little bit. I want to talk a little bit more about hot flushes and night sweats, if that's okay, and then also cortisol. So, what's actually happening in our brain when we're having a hot flush. I think there's a pretty viral video that's gone all over the internet recently. I don't know if you've seen it, of a lady with her head literally steaming at a sports game. Do you know the one I mean?
Yes, yeah, I have seen that one.
What is actually going on inside the brain that's making us feel that we are so hot?
So, when your estrogen levels drop, your hypothalamus, which is our brain's temperature regulation center, becomes much more sensitive. So, it's going to be much more likely to react to increases or decreases. So, if there's a slight decrease, then your body is going to be overreacting and it's going to be much more likely to cause a massive increase in your metabolism and your temperature. So, it's really this loss of um, it's not really a loss of regulation. It actually becomes, oversensitive in a sense.
And basically, it is amazing as a doctor when you give someone estrogen back, those hot flushes, if you get the dose right, they just go. So it's definitely a very, very specific, well, probably estrogen symptom. I know that men can also have it when they're lacking in testosterone. I want to talk to you about cortisol. Very recently, I've had quite a few women asking me to check their cortisol levels, and that, various people have told them that they've got high cortisol. And it's definitely something that people seem to be talking about more and more. Certainly, as a doctor, it's not a test that we do routinely. I suppose my, for want of a better word, argument would be I don't know how helpful it is to do a one off cortisol level because cortisol is bouncing around all over the place. So, kind of really, what's it going to tell me? But definitely people are talking about people having these high cortisol levels. What are we actually talking about here? And is this something that we need to be concerned about?
Yeah, look, so cortisol does naturally change in levels throughout the course of the day. As I mentioned, it's really important. It's a really important trigger for us to wake up in the morning. And it's constantly being released during times of stress. So, whenever our fight or flight system becomes activated, whenever our blood glucose goes too low, all these things are going to trigger cortisol. And cortisol is great. It is allowing us to ensure our body functions and meet the demands of society and life. So, having spikes of cortisol throughout the day is normal and it's great. I guess the problem happens is when that cortisol level is consistently elevated for too long. So if you're constantly experiencing stress, which happens in our daily lives, whether it's being stuck in traffic or having an argument or trying to get your kids to get dressed and go to school, all of these things will be triggering that release of cortisol. And ultimately, whilst our fight or flight system is really important for dealing with situations. Having it activated consistently for too long does lead to long term changes in the body and the brain. So, when our body is stuck in this survival mode, then ultimately we do see these long term changes. And those long term changes in the brain are a shrinkage of the memory center. We see an expansion of the emotion center, the amygdala becomes a bit bigger. And we also see a bit of a shrinkage of the frontal cortex, which is our decision making part of the brain. And when we look at it like that, if you've got an increase in the size of the amygdala, you become potentially more aggressive, more emotional. If you've got a shrinkage of the decision making part, you have a harder time, weighing up the decision and using your knowledge and your wisdom to deal with that situation. You become more selfish. Your attention is affected. And also, if you have a shrinkage of the hippocampus, your learning and memory is going to be impaired as well. So, whether you have whether you have a uterus, sorry, whether you have ovaries or not, you're going to have these effects of cortisol on the body. But I guess it's particularly pronounced when you're going through perimenopause and beyond because your body is much less resilient to stress. Okay, so you're much more likely to have these long term changes affecting you on a daily basis. And it's tricky because, at the end of the day, we can't always control the source of stress in our lives. Life is always going to be full of these difficult situations that we can't escape. But what we can do is choose how we respond to those situations. And I think there's a lot of really useful things that we can do to reduce the impact of stress in our lives. But as I've ultimately mentioned, having these high levels of cortisol at bedtime, it's going to stop you from sleeping. It's going to make you wake up throughout the course of the night. But also, as you mentioned, a single cholesterol measurement at one point in the day is not reflective of how it's changing over the course of the day. So you might be stressed when the needle is being taken and inserted and your blood is being, when you're having that done, and that could also impact, your cortisol readings. And it's not necessarily reflective of the undulations throughout the course of the day. But it's not to say that it is not useful in some way as well.
Does looking at your phone, like, they call it doom scrolling on Instagram, does that put your cortisol level up?
Do you know the answer to that? Cortisol?
I don't know. I'm just wondering, or is it just the light of the phone that's suppressing melatonin and that's what's keeping you awake?
Yeah, in terms of the effect of using your phone at bedtime, we used to think it was because of the light from your phone, but now we realize that it's not really so much the light from your phone. The blue light coming from your phone isn't really enough to disrupt sleep. So we used to think that blue light at bedtime was really a major thing that disrupts your sleep. And it's not to say that it isn't, but it's more to do with the kind of content that you're looking at. So if you're looking at you know, things that are stimulating you, whether it's, a stressful work email or, something that's really engaging your brain, then that is ultimately increasing your alertness and therefore decreasing your ability to fall asleep. So that's really the reason why we should avoid our phones at bedtime. It's more about the kind of things that we're watching, rather than the fact that the screens are bright. That's not to say that light isn't important. So, in terms of things that are really important to help us get to sleep, we don't want to have bright lights in our room. And it's the angle of light that's also really important as well. So, here's an example. So, as the sun goes through, through the sky throughout the course of the day, when the sun is just directly above us, it activates the receptors in our eyes that are pointing upwards in a very specific way that enhances our alertness. So what that means is whenever you've got a light that's shining down from above you, that's basically sending a signal to your brain saying, "Hey, it's the middle of the day. Be awake, be alert," and it's going to make it harder for you to get to sleep. Right. So if you've got downlights in your bedroom, it makes it much more difficult for you to fall asleep. So my recommendation there would be to make sure lights in your bedroom are either below eye level or the lights coming down, shining up from the ground. That's going to be much less likely to activate those receptors in the eyes that are pointing upwards, looking for the sun above you.
Right. Okay. That's so interesting. So many women find this sleep issue extremely distressing. They're exhausted. They're at the end of their tether. They're feeling like everything's falling apart. And I kind of feel that it can go maybe one of three ways. So one group probably don't do very much about it and just sort of stay distressed. And they maybe, do things like walking or trying to exhaust themselves going to the gym. And then I have another group who kind of go down the route of sort of sleep aids like melatonin, magnesium, antihistamines, rest of it, sleeping tablets, anything they can kind of get from either the doctor or the pharmacy. And then I see a third group of women who use alcohol and sometimes drugs to get to sleep, such as their level of desperation around sleep. I would love to have a little bit of a chat, probably about the sort of the second two groups. Maybe if we start with the last group who are using alcohol and drugs, I'd love to understand what's going on with the metabolism and the reaction of the brain in midlife to alcohol, because I think incidental to that is lots of women will tell me they feel like they can't drink alcohol anymore. If anything, they feel like if they do drink alcohol, they end up being awake half the night. So what's going on? Is something changing in how the brain copes with alcohol? And why is having a bottle of wine to make yourself sort of unconsciously asleep probably not the right choice?
Alcohol is a sedative, so it will help you ultimately fall asleep, but it massively alters your sleep architecture. So basically, what will happen if you've been drinking before you go to bed is you have lots of tiny micro awakenings throughout the course of the night. So you mightn't even recall that they've happened, but you will wake up. And that's why you won't feel refreshed after a night, if you've been sleeping before sorry, and that's why you won't feel refreshed if you've drunk alcohol before you go to bed. So, in terms of women's women who report having a decreased tolerance to alcohol through perimenopause and beyond, I'm not sure if there's any studies on that, but I guess I could hypothesize that if you've got disruptions in your sleep and you've also got therefore decreased removal of waste in the brain through the course of the night, then all of these metabolic products that are involved in breaking down alcohol, they're less likely to be properly removed if you've got disrupted sleep. So that's why you're probably much more likely to have these lingering effects of consuming alcohol.
Okay. And what are your thoughts on women using things like melatonin, magnesium, L-theanine seems to be a very popular one. Like, do you think that that's helpful, or is it placebo, or, what do you think about using such supplements?
I think ultimately sleep is a pillar of health, right? And chemically induced is not great, but ultimately it's also better than nothing. So if you think of it in that respect, then maybe it's still something that you should take because at least you're getting some sleep. But I think the key thing is to try and avoid habitual use. So we hear that melatonin is not a habit forming thing, but I think that's misleading because whenever you take anything habitually, your body adapts to having it there. So the receptors in your brain will adapt to having large amounts of melatonin, right? And then when the nights that you don't take it, you won't be able to sleep because your brain has adapted to having those large amounts there. So if you do take melatonin, I guess my recommendation there would be to keep your dose low, under 3 milligrams, and to use it sporadically. I see a lot of supplements on the market which have like 5 or 10 milligrams, which is just nuts because anything more is going to be so super physiological, so like so high above what our body is used to, that it's just going to accelerate the rate that our brain adapts to having it there. So it's going to make it so difficult to ever sleep without it. So if you're taking more than that, taper it down, and just try and keep it something that you use sporadically. So this magnesium L-threonate is the only form of magnesium that crosses the blood-brain barrier and goes into the brain. And we know that magnesium has important roles in the brain. And look, if you find it's beneficial for you, it's not doing any harm. Magnesium is useful for lots of different processes throughout the body. So, I wouldn't see any harm in that.
And what about people who are like literally going to the gym and, you know, like working out to the point of absolute exhaustion? I have quite a few women who've come to see me and that's what they were doing because it was the only way they could go to sleep. Is that bad?
Ultimately, cardiovascular, it's good for our cardiovascular system and it's good for our brain in lots of other ways. So I definitely wouldn't, discourage that. But I think it's important to also think about the time of the day that you're exercising. So if you exercise in the morning, great. And it's also going to help trigger your circadian rhythm and make it easier for you to sleep at night. But if you're exercising in the evening, it's going to raise your cortisol levels and make it harder for you to sleep. So be really intentional about the time of day that you do exercise.
And we use sleep training, or some people use sleep training with babies. What do you think about retraining sort of a middle-aged woman with sort of training their brain to get better sleep in midlife? Is that something that's possible, or are you one who encourages people to have a bit of a sort of rigid sleep routine?
Yeah, sleep hygiene is really important. And I think the most important thing for sleep is consistency. So trying to make up for lost sleep on the weekend is, you know, by all means do that. But the most important thing is to have consistency. So you really want to try to go to bed at the same time as much as possible, waking up at the same time as much as possible. Because if you've already got some dysregulation in sleep because of, these fluctuations in hormones, then having that one thing consistent is really going to make a very powerful difference. And I guess ultimately the science says that consistent sleeping habits are the most important thing that we can do.
Do we know that if women move through perimenopause and menopause and beyond, and they don't take menopausal hormone therapy, will their sleep eventually return to normal or some type of normal?
So I guess here's the thing is that as we age, we make less of that sleep inducing hormone melatonin anyway. And as I mentioned, melatonin is made from serotonin. So we do see dysregulation in sleep as we age. So I think it's probably maybe unrealistic to expect, for you to ever bounce back. But our brain does eventually adapt to these changes in hormones. So you should ultimately see a little bit of a balancing out over time.
I have to say, whenever women do start menopausal hormone therapy, I do find that sleep is one of the first things to settle. And it is interesting because some women feel like it's the progesterone that's really helping their sleep. But then there's women that we're not putting them on progesterone. Potentially they don't have a uterus. We're using estrogen only. And yet they will also have a fantastic improvement in sleep. And I do think that getting people sleeping is probably one of my most major focuses in my initial menopausal consultations, because I genuinely believe that if you've had a night's sleep, you can conquer anything. And if you haven't slept, particularly if it's for days, weeks, or months, everything in your life feels 100 times worse.
When we are sleep deprived, our emotional regulation goes completely out of whack. So, one night of sleep deprivation makes our amygdala, the emotion part of the brain, 60% more reactive. So, of course, if you're sleep deprived, you're going to be, potentially more emotional and more reactive to different situations. So, it definitely makes sense. Also, our perception of pain becomes worse and more pronounced if we're sleep deprived. Our ability to do lots of other things is really influenced by how much sleep we've had. So once you've got sleep in check, a lot of these other symptoms that you have might be a little bit reduced as well.
Leila, I just want to ask you a final question about the brain, which is, and sleep. What's one thing that you wish more people knew about the importance of their sleep for their brain?
Ultimately, it's resetting so many different things. It's resetting our metabolism, our emotional control, you know, even our immune systems. So all of these things are really important. But also, I think it's most important for memory and learning and memory as well. And when you've got issues with learning and memory, which we notice throughout this perimenopausal period, it's really important to prioritize that sleep and really think of it as a pillar of health.
Amazing. Leila, I ask every guest to the podcast the same question. If you could chat to 20-year-old Leila, what would you say to her?
If I was to give advice to a younger me, I would say, number one, maybe don't do something because you're afraid of the outcome. Do it because you're scared, because if you own those actions, you're going to grow and it's going to make you a better version of yourself. And I think I just like to remind myself that I'm going to be okay. And being okay is totally possible. And it doesn't matter where you've come from, it doesn't matter the hardship that you've had in your life. Because you're embracing your education and taking the opportunities around you, that's the thing that is going to equalize it. I came from a disadvantaged background, and I know that my education and the opportunities that I threw myself into allowed me to create the life that I have today. So I would really want to say to young Leela that you're going to be okay, but really don't give up. And there are times when you could give up, but your resilience through that is what's made you to the person that you are today.
I love that. Leila, thank you so much. You've been amazing. Thank you for sharing some of your knowledge on the brain. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been my pleasure too. Thanks so much.
This podcast and any information, advice, opinions, or statements within it do not constitute medical, healthcare, or other professional advice. Information is provided for educational and entertainment purposes only. If you have any health concerns, always consult your doctor.